Hello, I'm Meri Fatin. Welcome to Cover, presented by Writing WA. It's our opportunity to meet a West Australian author and hear all about their latest book. My guest today is Sam Carmody to talk about his debut novel, The Windy Season. Thanks for being here, Sam.
Thank you for having me, Meri.
Now, the main character in this book is Paul. He's 17 years old. Tell us why he finds himself in the town of Stark.
Well, yeah, Paul is a sort of an awkward 17-year-old kid from Perth, with sort of no interest in the ocean or heading north, but his brother works up on a cray boat up north. And then one day his older brother just goes missing and there's no sign of him for weeks. And as tends to happen with missing persons cases, the family starts to disintegrate and Paul decides just to get out of the house, and he goes north and almost retraces his brother's footsteps. He goes to Stark, where his brother lived. He works on the cray boat that his brother lived on, and it's not so much about trying to sort of find his brother like a detective. You know, he's just a silly kid, but he's almost trying to feel his brother there in a way.
He wants to be in the last space he was seen in.
Exactly. But nevertheless, even though he's not really trying to find out what happened to him, those sort of darker forces eventually move in on him. Yeah.
The earliest kernel of this book actually comes from an experience that your grandmother, a novelist, Fredmm, gave to you. Tell me a little bit about that early experience. Yeah,
so Grandma was, she was a novelist and she was a maritime historian living in Marmion in Perth, and not that I knew any of that, I didn't know any of that career.
She was just Grandma.
She was just Grandma, and we'd come down from Geraldton to visit, and we'd be straight down in front of her house in Marmion out in the water all the time, surfing and snorkeling and things. And I think she loved our love of the sea, but also seemingly wanted to complicate it. You know, we were only 5 to 10 years old at the time, and she would, on sort of birthdays or Christmases, give us books about sharks. And I remember one, I've still got it, this Reader's Digest called Sharks. It's got this big toothy, bronzy on the cover, but inside it's all this blood and teeth and there's coronial photographs, and you know, just to think that I had this when I was that little, you know.
Was she trying to warn you?
I'll never know. You know, she died when I was 15, and so I never got the chance to really ask her the question about what she was doing. And she definitely gave me something like a phobia, I think, of sharks. I mean, I've surfed all my life, but it's always something I think about. I sometimes wonder if it was almost an artist lesson that she was trying to give me, you know, that to learn to love and appreciate the shadows in things as much as the kind of the beauty, so the dark and the light, and to be aware of both of those things. And I don't know if it was that, or she was just it was her way. I don't know, she has a dark sense of humour, I'm not too sure. But
you dedicated the book to her, in fact. So, I mean, how profound was her influence on you? Almost posthumous.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely, even at the time, I remember she always had her old typewriter sitting on the kitchen table with her windows kind of looking out over Marmion and the Indian Ocean, and she would let me go on there, and I didn't know it was the typewriter she would used to write all her books on and write radio plays for the BBC and all these things on. It was just Grandma's sort of typewriter, and she would let me on there, and I'd write strange little stories and she would stick them on her fridge. And I always, you know, I think even as a small kid, I identified something in her that was very. We got along really well, and yeah, but it was only later that I did. You know, there's all these questions I love to ask her now about writing. You know, when I was in the midst of the draft, and when on the days it goes hard, I would have loved the opportunity to ask her. You know, what, you know, if she had any suggestions, and that is kind of sad, but also I know how proud she would be to know that I'm here and I have a first book out.
And it's interesting that right from that early influence of your love of the sea that she nurtured, and that when you, even from those early days when you were studying creative writing at university, you were writing about the sea.
Yeah, I was down in Perth then, and all my first assignments, and you'd be in little workshop classes. I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with the writing workshop. And they'll be reading my stories and wondering why I'm writing about, you know, a childhood in Geraldton. And it was kind of everything I was writing. And I think they had this kind of healthy radar for nostalgia, you know, but it was more complicated than that for me. I think the sea was never just a simple nostalgic place. It was a place that I loved and was terrified of.
Yeah. And
I knew towns like Geraldton and all the fishing towns, I knew they were more complicated than little nice holiday getaways, and I was interested in exploring that.
Yeah, because you told me that with the windy season that you wanted to explore the kind of horror and the fascination of the sea and that kind of unknowableness of it, but also about, I guess, the unique relationship that West Australians have with our coastline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, I mean, sharks are obviously been a big topic of conversation for a long time, and probably forever in Western Australia. And you sort of hear a lot of talk, particularly in the surfing community, oddly, there's a lot of talk about, you know, the guys just hate sharks and they just want to fish them all out. And I can understand that, but I also don't really believe it when they say they hate sharks either. You know, the other day when I got into Perth, I went and got a coffee just down at Yellow and Trigg, and there apparently had been a bronze whaler shark had breached just off the coast there, and there was hundreds and hundreds of people all craning their necks over the cycle path and all over the beach, and just to get a glimpse of it. And it wasn't fear. There was a genuine sense of joy and excitement of this idea that a shark had come in to visit us, you know, and we might be able to see it. So I think as much as we might almost think we hate them, and we might even try to deny it, I think we love them too. There's something about them that enriches the coast for us and complicates our relationship with the ocean. Yeah,
because it makes something that would be, I guess, I mean, it's dangerous in other ways as well, but it would take a huge amount of fear away from something that's essentially beautifully enjoyable.
Yeah, it would turn it into a big swimming pool.
Yeah.
You know, and I think we always gravitate to excitement. It's, you know, when a long weekend comes around, we head north, we head south, and we like to go into sort of wildernesses. And for the fact that they are wildernesses still, you know, I think there's something incredibly important there in our relationship with us as humans, and I find that really interesting. Yeah.
And you depict that amazingly well, also in Paul's experience of when he goes out onto the cray boat and just there's just nothing good about his experience of working on the cray boat. He suffers from seasickness. It's actually terrifying. You describe it in a way that, you know, you really, as a reader, viscerally experience what it's like to be out in that expanse of ocean and how vulnerable and small you feel.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that people can almost relish that, you know, almost admit that. I mean, it would be great, even for me as a writer, I suppose, it would be great to sell myself as some kind of Hemingway, you know, waterman who wasn't afraid of anything. But that's just not true. And I think I've had some readers. I popped into a couple of bookstores yesterday and just met some booksellers around Perth, and one seller was just saying how she loved that. She was laughing so much because she could identify with just being in the water and kind of looking around for shadows and imagining, you know, an attack in progress, you know, and feeling slightly more alive when you hit the shore again, you know.
Yeah.
Just, I think people have enjoyed seeing that sort of fleshed out, celebrating the fear, I suppose.
One of the other themes that you explore in this book really beautifully is masculinity, and what's really interesting to me about that is how you weren't aware yourself at first that was an element that you would explore so deeply in writing this book.
Yeah, I didn't really know what I was writing for a long time, and I think I hear a lot of writers say a novel kind of emerges, you know, and you just sit there and you do the work and the novel will eventually show up and what you were trying to write would show up. And originally I was really interested in those communities that I grew up in, and particularly the men in those communities. You know, I was always interested in the things that, you know, the things that those men didn't say as much as they did say, you know, all the silences of men and how they didn't have the language for the kind of, I suppose there's sort of shadows within them, you know. There was, I was always fascinated by that, but it was only late in the piece that sort of a writing, or so I suppose a friend now and mentor, Charlotte Wood. I was lucky that she read a draft of the novel and said, yeah, you're writing about masculinity, you know, and I just thought I was writing about fishermen and surfers. I didn't realise I was actually, you know, examining where that silence comes from in men and the damage that might do to them.
Yeah, how destructive. Although you did say earlier that you were aware, even, you know, growing up in Geraldton, that it was more that those places were more than just holiday towns, and that you were aware of that dark side on some level. It's always been bubbling there, obviously.
I think so. I mean, for me, Geraldton's always been, and I think that does happen, your childhood always does. There is that kind of, it's not a purely anti-pastoral kind of view I have of those places. There is something that I'm drawn to still. It's still the sort of the fascination and the love of the sea, and they're beautiful. But I was always aware, my parents worked in the hospital system in Geraldton, and so I knew the sort of stories that they would come home with. So I knew that, you know, whether it was with sort of drugs and alcohol or domestic violence, I knew that those towns had just all the same complications that the city has, and they're never simple.
Yeah. Although, I mean, Stark is, well, Geraldton compared to Stark is like a buzzing metropolis by comparison, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. No, Geraldton's become incredibly sort of cosmopolitan these days than how it was when I grew up there. But I still do think, you know, within particularly male sort of communities, whether it's surfing or fishing or, you know, a lot of even AFL, you know, there are these domains still that men are, in my view, a little bit straitjacketed still. You know, there's that legacy of the kind of, I suppose, the digger kind of mythology, or whether it's the bushman, or, you know, but about just being kind of stoic and just not talking about anything. Really.
Quite solitary. And also the way their representations of friendship towards each other were kind of a bit screwed up as well.
Yeah. I always found, and I think that was always interesting to me as well. I always felt like a little bit, I was in those communities, I was surfing, I was into my sort of footy, but I always felt like a little bit of an outsider. And I think I think they considered me as a little bit of an outsider. They knew I was, you know, a writer, you know, like, so I think they were sort of suspicious, and they probably even said less around me because of that.
They thought they might be providing material for you, probably.
And here they go.
Yeah. And I love the fact that, in fact, relatively transparently, Paul and Elliot are based on you and your older brother.
Yeah, my brother it was lovely. He was up for the launch the other night, for the book launch, and I'd sort of jokingly sort of signed his book, but, you know, just wrote, you know, I'm sorry I keep writing about you. Because I think all my life, I don't know if it's a younger brother thing, you know, that you always just have your target set on your older brother, and you're just always so aware of them and what they do and fascinated by them. And I feel very sorry for him that he, you know, I don't know, I think that relationship is obviously so meaningful to me.
Well, you said at the launch about you thanked him for, I guess, kind of engendering your love of the sea, that you have a mistrust of the ocean, but that he leads you to it even despite that. What's that? Is that something that still exists in the relationship?
Oh, absolutely. He lives in Denmark now, down south, and I'll go down to visit him, and I know we'll be going surfing, and the night before I'll be sort of lying awake, knowing that he'll want to, you know, get us in the full drive, we'll bush bash for, you know, an hour, we'll end up on some remote beach, you know, in the dark. I'll be sort of looking for other sort of headlights for other cars, hoping some other surfers will turn up, and they won't, and we'll be paddling out before the sun's even really up and sitting out the back on some remote kind of peninsula. And it kind of terrifies me, and I've always been like that, but I love it too. You know, he's dragged me into places, and these beautiful places that I feel privileged to see, you know. And so, but, you know, he's not very sympathetic when I, you know, complain. And
it's just the sharks that are scaring you, or is there more to it than that?
I think it really is, for me, it's sharks. I think, again, Grandma's books, I think probably have left their mark. But I mean, Liam's funny because he is quite, you know, he's a lot more of the kind of the Hemingway than I am. He's very much like Elliot in the book. He's just not afraid of anything. It's seemingly from the younger brother. And my older brother always says, you know, the only thing that makes him ever think about sharks is just all the bad vibes that I'm sending out in the water, you know, all my beating heart, and, you know, I must sound like a panicked fish to a shark, you know. Yeah, it's very funny, but he's good. He tolerates it.
Yeah. So in the story, Paul, interestingly, although he goes to Stark and gets immersed into that space where Elliot was last seen, doesn't appear to actually do much to try and find him. Why was that? Why did his character behave that way?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, I think his age just probably explains a bit of that. I suppose he's only 17. And there's also, early on, there's the kind of the belief, the police are even telling the family, expect the worst, you know. Because I think that might happen with young men. I think sometimes with missing persons, there is that kind of suspicion in the community that, you know, maybe they got mixed in the wrong crowd, or they've kind of done it to themselves, you know, brought whatever it is upon themselves. So I think the family's already grieving as if he's gone and he's dead. So I don't think Paul really believes that, you know, there is any hope there. But also, I think Paul is probably very much like I was when I was that age. I think very hyper anxious, you know, he's a listless kind of character, which just sets him apart from his brother. His brother wasn't quite the same.
It was why he was energised by his brother, obviously.
Yeah. And was interested in that sort of his brother's recklessness, I suppose, and that difference. And so that might be it. And I think it might be interesting in that way. It doesn't really function as a crime novel, because Paul's not sort of crashing through the narrative. Really, rather, he's a bit like I was, you know, sitting at the back of the surf. He's kind of sending bad vibes out, and he's afraid. And all those kind of predators in the town sort of eventually move in on him and force him to act ultimately.
Yeah. And but what does happen then is that there's a number of really tough female characters in the book, and one of them is the solitary local policewoman, Fredmm. So tell me about her, because she kind of instigates momentum for him, but is also based on Frida.
Yeah, my grandma, she came sort of quite late in the book, because I think Paul, I was conscious of that. He has sort of really nowhere to go, and he was sort of isolated in that town. And I almost felt like when I was in the midst of the book and sort of struggling to work out where to go with it and what happened to Elliot. And those mysteries were still too much of a mystery to me as a writer. So I think I had almost her move in, a bit like my grandma, perhaps, to help guide me and Paul through to the end of the book, in a way. So it was interesting. I remember as soon as I put her in there and I used my grandma's name, it started to go again, which is sort of, and it's quite interesting to think about that now.
Yeah. And tell me a little bit more about why the female characters were also kind of, I guess, capable and brusque and tough.
I think that's been my experience of a lot of women who have become sort of my writing mentors. I mean, I think particularly in, say, the writing world, it's definitely dominated more by women, and my mentors have always been female authors, mostly. And I think I've always observed, and including my older sister and my grandmother, have observed the resilience in the face of a lot of sort of men who are dealing with issues. You know, and it was always funny to me, you know, for a long time I probably fell for that cliche that, you know, women are the emotional ones and men aren't, you know. But as I've grown older, I've seen more men who are dealing with sort of difficult kind of emotional and sort of psychic troubles, and women who seem to be the ones sort of trying to keep everything together, to keep a family. Yeah. So I think it really has come through from observation that turned up in the book, that the women kind of had their act together more than men.
And almost that they couldn't really have survived in that space if they had been different to that.
No, exactly. They sort of had to grow sort of hard into it. I mean, I think in the end as well, Paul even asks Jules, the sort of barmaid in the town, like, how do you put up with these guys? And how can you still work in that place? You're being surrounded by these creatures, essentially, what these men have become. And she sort of says to Paul, look, I'm not afraid of them. They're all ghosts. They act tough, but there's nothing really to them. And she can see the fear within them.
Yeah, that they recognise that they're actually really not offering very much to the world, and they're pretty upset by it.
Yeah, they almost hate themselves. Yeah. Those women characters really just are born from my experience. So.
Yeah, we're necessarily like that.
Yeah.
And there's a second thread in the book which turns out to be a really interesting element of this story, which is that first-person narrative from someone we find to be called Swiss.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about that and about how that developed.
Well, Swiss came late. So this book was always, for a long time, I was on a sort of a mouse wheel. I got quite lucky early on that the publisher had caught a draft early and wanted to publish it. But, you know, it was 30,000 words at the time, and they said, you know, look, we'll publish it. Can you just make it 80,000 words? And I was like, sure, you know, easy, you know, because he's just so excited to get published. I'll do it, whatever you want.
Yeah.
But then I, you know, realised I had to write a completely different book, and I had to sort of find out what might have happened to Elliot. So that was a huge problem that I hadn't really solved the whole time through writing it, and I passed through deadlines, and I was in a horrible kind of state because I was just assuming that I can't work out how this book's going to end.
Did it almost feel like it was perfect at 30,000 words and that you couldn't make it bigger than what it was?
Yeah, I mean, in that draft, Elliot was just gone, you know, and Paul was sort of dealing with it in the aftermath. It was much more about him just dealing with grief. But I realised that in a longer novel, Elliot just disappearing might not have been very satisfactory, and people might have been more interested, and Paul would have been more interested over time in what actually has happened to him. So I was in a little cabin in the Blue Mountains, the Eleanor Dark sort of foundation, Varuna House, on a sort of snowy week in August last year, and this was the week that my publisher said, okay, you have this week and it's better be done, you know, by Friday.
And no pressure.
No pressure, and I was still in this position where I had no idea what was going on, and I was just spending most of my time actually not writing, but just sort of lying in bed sort of depressively, trying to avoid everything. But then I think it was probably the third day, on the Wednesday, I actually got up and I couldn't sort of work on the sort of the third person thing, so I just started something new, and I just wrote this first person voice, and it ended up being this bloke Swiss who was this kind of the henchman of a bikie chief, and the Swiss knew everything that happened. He would know what had happened to Elliot, so he would provide eventually through the story the answer that I needed. So I just madly wrote for a few days and sent it to the publisher and sort of crossed my fingers. And
what was the reaction when you sent that through?
They were really pleased. I think they'd probably realised that I was in a puzzle and I had, in a way, kind of cracked it.
Yeah.
So there was probably a lot of relief from them, and luckily. And
can you remember thinking, if I do this, this will be the solution to resolving the book, or did it just start flowing out of the pen?
It did actually fly out of the pen, and for years I hadn't had that experience, you know, and I started to read about other writers saying, is it even true that can happen, that it can come out quickly, because I'd forgotten that it had ever felt like that. But yeah, it was one of those times where it just pours out of you, and I think in a couple of days I'd written sort of, you know, 12,000 words of this character, which is the thread that goes right through, and I was really lucky. I always thank, you know, not to be too superstitious, but I always thank Eleanor Dark. I feel like she almost sent it to me, like I felt sorry for the rookie at her writing desk, going, oh God, you need some help. Yeah,
and it does help resolve, I mean, as resolved as it becomes in the end, really beautifully, that addition. One of the things that I've realised doing these cover-to-cover interviews over time is that writers, I guess, behave in the writing space really differently. Some people can knock out a book every 12 months to deadline, and other people can take years and years and, you know, lie depressively in beds and worry and then deliver something exquisite. But now you're teaching up in Darwin, and I was wondering now those roles are reversed, what you're like as a teacher, what your observations are, knowing that, you know, that they come in all shapes and sizes, good writers.
Yeah, well, I think, for one other thing, I'm very sympathetic to the kind of the agony that is presented by a blank page. I know all about that, you know. So I think the biggest thing with students is I can kind of help them get around it, and there's little techniques, you know, those things that one of my sort of writing mentors, Liz Bursky, always talked about, free writing. You know, just if you're completely stuck, you almost need to sort of get over or under the inner critic somehow, and the best way to do it is you set a timer for sort of 4 minutes or so, and you just have your pen to the page and you write anything until you know, and there's a weird thing that happens, you're just trying to get to the end of the alarm, but often a minute or two in you have descended into that kind of deeper imaginative space necessary to create, and you've got past that inner critic who's trying to tell you that every little word or any mark on the page you're making is a mistake. So we do a lot on that, and I think that's the big lesson I've learned, that it is difficult, but the thing is you can't wait for perfection. You know, as Margaret Atwood said, if I waited for perfection, I'd never write a word.
Yeah.
So I think that's really what I have to offer. It's almost like a counsellor type role.
Yeah.
Because it is hard, that anxiety, and it can be paralysing.
Yeah, and the doubt. I need to ask you before we finish about your recommendation for a West Australian book, and you've chosen something quite inspiring.
Yeah, I brought in a book called The Turning, which is the Tim Winton collection, and there's a particular favourite story in there. It's the longest story called Bone and McFarlane's Mole, and it's the story of a female protagonist, Jackie, who's living in Perth, and she's sort of casting back into the past to her childhood on the southwest coast of Australia. And I think, you know, what that captured for me so beautifully was how there is nothing simple and nostalgic, you know, about that tale, about going back to the coast. And I think that often gets that stereotype that it's an easy road to take, but it has this beautiful complexity and observations about again men, and about what it is like to live away from the cities, and it has all that, the same kind of beauty and darkness. It doesn't say the easy road. It's not purely anti-pastoral, but it's not this simple pastoral. It's this incredibly beautifully, masterfully done complex narrative.
Sam, I think you're only just starting to reap the rewards of all of the effort and intensity that's gone into writing The Windy Season, but it is an impressive read, and thank you so much for writing it, and thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Meri.
All the books we feature on Cover to Cover are recommended for book clubs because we think they'll generate great discussions, and Writing WA has created book club notes for each of them. You can download them from the For Readers section of our website. We realise that many of our viewers don't have a local bookshop where they can buy the books we discuss on the show, so we've made a special arrangement with Crow Books in Perth. Place your order with them by phone, mention the code Cover to Cover, and you'll get the postage free. Next month on Cover to Cover, I'll meet Pat Lowe to discuss Two Sisters, which has recently been republished by Broome-based publisher Mugabala Books. Two Sisters tells the true story of the extraordinary lives of two Walmajari sisters and their exodus from the Great Sandy Desert following European settlement. We love receiving your feedback about Cover to Cover. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please use the email address shown on the screen. Thanks for joining me again this month. If you have writers in your communities in need of support or advice, then please encourage them to look through the information on Writing WA's website or to get in touch with us. Enjoy reading local, and I look forward to your company next month on Cover to Cover.